After being accidentally freed, an ancient parasitic creature terrorizes a small town by entering the host through their navels and consuming them until they become empty shells. Outside of the church in the year 1871, a priest extracted a deadly parasite from its host, who was currently chained to the ground in order to prevent it from taking more lives. In the present day, the church is mysteriously burned, and Josh, a firefighter, begins his investigation by checking the floorboards. Unfortunately for him, it's where the parasite is concealed, and it proceeds to drag him down so it can access his navel. Josh tries to leave, but the parasite has entered his system, leaving him disoriented. Meanwhile, Scott Miller reunites with Jessie, his former love interest, after serving 2 years in prison. Jessie apologizes to him for not continuing their communication, reasoning that she's been preoccupied in the past few years. He assures her that it's fine because he understands her circumstances. Moving on, Jessie wonders if he's been seeing someone, and Scott confirms that he's dating Lydia. This time, Scott shifts the question to Jessie, and the woman simply denies any involvement with anyone. Since it's getting late, Scott declares that he has to leave, but he invites Jessie to watch his hockey game later. During the hockey game, Scott's delighted that Jessie has attended, but because he's distracted, he bumps into another player, causing him to stumble. Jessie stifles a laugh at the spectacle, but Lydia notices their interaction, making her suspicious of their relationship. At that moment, Josh appears and locates Lydia, who's also his lover, compelling him to pass through the ice rink. Lydia's afraid that her little secret will be revealed, so she leaves the bleachers and heads to the locker room. The disoriented firefighter follows her, and Lydia reprimands him for causing a scene. In the dim room, Josh aggressively pushes Lydia into the lockers, causing his badge to fall. The woman thinks that they're about to make love, but Josh proceeds to transfer the parasite into her navel. For a moment, Lydia blanks out, unaware that the parasite has possessed her. When her wits return, she sees Josh grasping her clothes, so she pushes him away thinking he's a creep. Now alone, Josh starts to scream in agony as blood pours out of his eyes and mouth. Back in the rink, Scott confronts Lydia for her absence during his game, and the woman lies about having to use the bathroom. Scott knows she is lying because it's actually located on the other side. Disappointed in her, Scott goes to the locker room to face Lydia's other lover. He's surprised that the room is empty, but upon seeing the firefighter's badge, it's enough to confirm that Lydia is indeed cheating on him. Shortly after the game, Scott shows Lydia the firefighter's badge, and the woman accuses Josh of being her obsessive stalker just to appear innocent. Initially, Scott is skeptical of her, but Lydia uses her charms against him, causing him to be softer to her. That night, Scott arrives outside Lydia's residence, but as he rings her doorbell, the woman has yet to answer. Unbeknownst to him, she's still preparing in the bathroom, for she has created a huge mess in appeasing her appetite. Scott tries to call Lydia, but he still gets no response, thinking their date might be postponed. As he starts to leave, Scott discovers that Lydia is now outside, so he decides to follow his girlfriend. At the club, Lydia dances with a man named Daryl, just in time for Scott to catch them in the act, upsetting him. Due to the rising tension between them, Daryl takes Lydia to the bathroom. Scott has no choice but to follow them, and when he peeks through the door, he feels betrayed that Lydia's getting intimate with Daryl. Just as Scott leaves the pair alone to process his emotions, Lydia proceeds to transfer the parasite to Daryl. Following this, a confused Daryl hurriedly leaves the bathroom, surprising Scott. His suspicious behavior bothers him, so he checks on Lydia. He finds her staring into the wall, taking it as an opportunity to confront her for her continuous unfaithfulness. However, she remains silent, prompting Scott to check on her. He becomes terrified that blood oozes out of Lydia's face, and she throws up blood before she passes away. Two women witness such a horrific sight, causing them to scream out of fear. Thinking he'll be blamed for Lydia's death, Scott hurriedly flees from the scene. Later on, Scott sneaks into Jessie's room, for she's the only safe person he can stay with for a while. Jessie's alarmed at the bloodstains on him, thinking that he's been involved in a fight again. Scott denies her assumption, but he simply informs her that his uncle, Sheriff Durst, is after him, meaning he can't return home. Though dismayed, Jessie offers to lend him her father's clothes, but she orders him to leave the next day. The next day, Scott feels frustrated watching a news report about Lydia's death, wherein Durst declares that they have 2 eyewitnesses and a possible culprit. Jessie suddenly appears, so Scott tries to convince her that he didn't harm Lydia. He informs her that he found Lydia with blood trickling down her eyes, so he supposes that she might have acquired acquired a disease from Josh. Their conversations interrupted when the sheriff appears outside, so Scott's compelled to hide behind the door. Sheriff Durst asks Jessie if she knows about Scott's whereabouts, but with a change of heart, she remains silent. Moments later in the kitchen, Durst discovers a pile of men's clothes in the trash, making him feel disappointed in Jessie for lying to him. The woman tries to defend Scott, but Durst is distrustful of him because of his troublesome past. He discloses that Lucky, Scott's father, was supposed to be imprisoned, but his son simply assumed his sentence. Even with Scott's innocence, Durst is still untrustful of him because he believes he shares the same dirty blood as his father. At the mall, Daryl causes chaos in public as the Parasite is finding another host. Deputy Sam orders him to stay back, but Daryl refuses to cooperate, causing the officer to shoot him in the leg. Suddenly, the crowd screams turn louder as consecutive gunshots hit Daryl, ending his life. It turns out that Durst fired the shots because Sam starts to falter. Meanwhile, Scott sneaks inside the fire station to search for any information regarding Josh. Using the activity log, he's satisfied to discover that Josh's last mission was the burnt church. However, his investigations interrupted when a guard enters the room to answer a call. Outside the hospital, an ER technician named Eddie, who assisted Daryl in the ambulance, is strangely covered in his blood, surprising the paramedic and doctor. Back in Jessie's house, she watches the news and learns that Daryl's eyes are full of blood, reminding her of the same discovery Scott had with Lydia. With this in mind, she contacts Scott and offers her help in investigating the bizarre event that transpires in their town. Right away, the pair heads to the burned church, and Jessie points at the axe sticking out a puncture, rendering them confused. Scott volunteers to retrieve it, but Jessie's suspicious of it for it smells acidic. Again, they check the puncture, and Jessie believes there's a room underneath the church's floorboards. In the cellar, Scott helps Jessie reach a hidden compartment underneath the floorboards, and she retrieves a letter beside a broken vessel. Out of curiosity, she reads it and learns that a creature called La Corrigia, or the Scourge, was sealed in the vessel in 1871. Jessie decides to use these details to browse their town's archive to find more information about the phenomenon. Scott becomes more alarmed, for he believes that the creature must have transferred to its new host, as Daryl is now gone. At the hospital's parking lot, Jessie returns to her car after she learns who the last person Daryl encountered was. She informs Scott that Eddie is probably the new host, and he can be found in the skate park. Speaking of Eddie, the man begs a female skater for some chips, for he can't stop his hunger. The skater refuses to give him, and instead, she orders him to perform a skateboard trick in exchange for it. Without a choice, Eddie complies. But in the middle of his execution, he stumbles, causing him to awaken the Parasite. Eddie continues to perform his trick, but as he gets the momentum, he attacks the skater. That evening in the library, Jessie browses the archives, and she learns that the last host, Edward Norberg, was struck by lightning, which was believed to be an act of divine intervention. To her surprise, Jessie discovers that he has descendants left, so she retrieves the telephone book and searches for their information. Meanwhile, Scott arrives at the skate park, but he feels troubled as he notices Eddie's body on the ground. The female skater denies inflicting harm on him, explaining that Eddie perished after attacking her. Scared that she might be infected, Scott tries to take her with him, but she refuses. Scott warns her that if she doesn't get treated immediately, she might suffer the same fate as Eddie. However, his persistence makes her feel threatened, so one of her friends strikes Scott unconscious. Later on in Miss Norberg's residence, Jessie interrogates the woman about what transpired in 1871. Miss Norberg reveals that the Scourge possessed her great-grandfather, which made him falsely blamed for the casualties. She explains that Edward devoted his life to trying to clear his name. Curious, Jessie asks for clarification about the real reason for Edward's death, and Miss Norberg shares that he was actually banished because the priests reported him dead. She clarifies that it was their way to explain the casualties and assure the public that the creature would not harm them anymore. When Edward eventually passes away, Miss Norberg stresses that all of his possessions are sent to them, which are stored in the coach house. She hands Jessie the key and gives her the freedom to check on them, much to her appreciation. While Jessie's mission's going well, Scott encounters trouble as Durst finds him alone with Eddie's body. Thinking he's the culprit for the casualties, Scott advises them to search for the female skater, warning them that she'll be next. Despite this, Durst refuses to acknowledge it, and he hypothesizes Scott is motivated to to kill Lydia and Josh because they're having an affair. Inside the jail, an inmate converses with Scott, and he discloses to him that Durst is actually a corrupt sheriff. He explains that he planted the car parts on Lucky's property after he failed to pay their monthly obligation to him, which leaves Scott in disbelief. Moving on, the biker shares an encounter he had with a female skater, wherein the woman started to throw up blood when she tried to be intimate with him. This makes Scott feel threatened, for he knows the biker is now infected. Not wasting any time, Scott summons Durst and reports to him that the biker is now a threat. He pleads with him to release him, but Durst refuses, allowing the biker to approach him. Scott kicks the man away, leading him to slam into the bed frame, leaving him unconscious. After seeing the biker's bizarre aggressiveness, Durst tries to free Scott, but the biker awakens. He attempts to attack Scott, but the man quickly closes the gate at him, chopping his fingers in the process. This catches Durst off guard, so the biker grabs him and transfers the parasite into his navel. In hopes of helping the sheriff, Scott grabs his gun, but he's too late as the parasite has possessed him. Seconds later, Durst returns to his senses, and he's surprised that Scott is threatening to shoot him. Scott, who's still shaken from the event, simply declares that he has to end his life. Durst talks him down, causing Scott to reconsider his actions. However, Durst betrays him and proceeds to steal the gun from him, resulting in Scott shooting the biker accidentally. Outside of the police station, Jessie is confused as to why Durst is chasing after Scott, so she decides to sneak into the sheriff's car to tag along. Once the authorities corner Scott, he confronts Durst for blackmailing Lucky, even though he knows his late father was suffering from a deadly disease. Instead of acknowledging it, Durst wants to focus on punishing Scott, but before he can proceed, Jessie appears with a taser, and she expresses her disappointment toward her uncle. Durst orders her not to intervene, but Jessie refuses to comply, so the sheriff attempts to steal the taser from her. Jessie fires it at him, leading the electric current to aggravate the parasite. Initially, Durst loses his life, but the parasite reanimates him, causing him to try attacking Sam. Even if it pains her, Jessie encourages Sam to kill the sheriff for he's already gone. Sam complies, and the deputy can't hide how shaken he is by killing his comrade. All of a sudden, Durst shoots Sam, compelling Scott and Jessie to flee. Upon entering the sheriff's car, Durst is about to shoot the pair, so Scott encourages Jessie to run him over. Jessie complies, but her undead uncle is unaffected, motivating Scott to pin him using the car's rear. For a moment, Durst becomes preoccupied as he tries to free himself, whereas Scott discovers that the vehicle has a gasoline leak, giving him the idea that they should burn him. Shortly after, Durst escapes the pinning at the expense of his legs, but Scott, with flares on hand, throws them in his direction, burning him alive. Following this, the pair head to a diner, and Jessie introduces the demonologist handbook to Scott, intriguing him. Later, as they continue their reading, Jessie realizes that they've made a mistake because the scourge is still in Durst's system. After all, it used his body as a shield against the fire. Afraid of the dangers it might create, the pair return to the crime scene, but to their dismay, the authorities and bystanders have crowded the area. Moreover, a nosy photographer disguised as a firefighter is near Durst's corpse, capturing his horrendous fate. Unfortunately for him, Durst awakens, and he transfers the scourge into his body. The police officers are upset at his intrusion, so they escort the photographer away from the scene. On the other hand, Jessie and Scott feel more threatened by the dangers the scourge might bring, so they decide to follow him to know where he's headed next. Soon after, at the bar, Jessie approaches the photographer who's trying to satiate his hunger through snacks. While she seduces him, Scott prepares the hotel room where they'll electrocute him. Not long after, Jessie takes the photographer to her motel room, and he places his camera on the cabinet hoping it'll capture their intimacy. Jessie is unbothered by it, for she knows nothing will happen between them. She invites him to sit down and pretends that it's part of her seduction. Then, she enters the bathroom to gather the rope, but Scott detects a faint smell of alcohol in her, surprising him. Jessie confirms that she drank alcohol as part of her charade. Upon retrieving the rope, Jessie decides to be in her underwear because she wants the photographer's undivided attention. During the photographer's electrocution, a fuse explodes, causing an electric interruption. Scott orders Jessie to open the fuse box as he'll be guarding the unconscious man. The woman heads to the bathroom and turns on the fuse box, but when she returns to the room, she's puzzled because Scott is standing bizarrely beside the photographer. Out of his will, Scott starts to attack Jessie because the Scourge is controlling him. He encourages her to run because he doesn't want to hurt her, but Jessie refuses, leading her to be subdued. On the bed, the Scourge emerges from Scott's mouth, but instead of possessing her, it returns inside him. Scott realizes that the alcohol she ingested earlier has driven the creature away. Now that the Scourge has returned to his system, Scott's hands attempt to choke her. For he's slowly losing control of himself, he orders Jessie to electrocute him and destroy the Scourge herself. Though reluctant, Jessie knows Scott has a point, so she grabs the lamp and uses it to electrocute him. Afterward, she grabs the forceps and extracts the creature from Scott, leaving him unconscious. Due to the creature's strength, Jessie stumbles, stringing along the photographer, which awakens him in the process. The man feels something's entered his system, but he pays no mind because he's confused about what's happening. Because Jessie has no time to explain, she orders him to summon help instead. As the photographer is away, Jessie finally dumps the Scourge into the vessel containing wine, weakening it. The next day, an occult priest burns the Scourge until it perishes, whereas Jessie and Scott watch it with great intrigue. Before the priest leaves, Scott wonders if there are more parasites out there, but the priest simply informs them that most of them were killed many years ago. Furthermore, his last encounter with a Scourge was 30 years ago. When the priest leaves, Jessie, whose feelings have deepened for Scott, wishes to accompany him in leaving their town. Meanwhile, in the hospital, a nurse feels uneasy after she hears a strange sound coming from the morgue. She checks inside the room, but she becomes terrified when she encounters the photographer feasting on a body.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.